This tiny lens has quickly become my go-to option for street photography, but what exactly makes it just so good? Well, this is the 28mm f2.8 lens from Brightin Star, and it's an ultra slimline pancake lens that's easily one of the smallest full-frame lenses I've ever seen. Now, I'll admit that when a super small lens like this comes out, I'm usually fairly skeptical because there are typically a huge amount of compromises that have to be made in order to keep a lens like this so compact and lightweight. And those sacrifices are usually made to things like build quality and image quality. But that's certainly not the case with this lens. Now, don't get me wrong, it definitely has its quirks, which we'll get onto a little bit later on, but on the whole, Brightin Star have really gotten a lot of things right with this, starting with the build. Now, if you've seen any of my videos before, then you'll know that I am a little bit of a sucker when it comes to retro-inspired technology. So when I saw this lens for the first time, it immediately drew me in with its retro charm. But there is certainly more to this lens than just its good looks, because the build quality is also very impressive, with it being predominantly made from solid brass, which isn't typically a material that's used these days because most manufacturers tend to opt for lighter weight composite materials, but brass has obviously been used in this case as a clear nod to vintage glass, which it obviously takes its inspiration from in terms of aesthetics, which I fully appreciate. And ultimately, it's one of the contributing factors as to why this lens is just so nice to handle. Now, there are benefits to using brass, of course, and the first one is fairly obvious. It's going to be very hard wearing, but this does mean that it's a little bit on the heavy side compared to other pancake lenses out there. But honestly, I quite like the fact that it's heavier, because once it's mounted to your camera, it actually makes it feel a lot better balanced than some of these ultra lightweight lenses. Now, if you actually flip the lens over, you can see that the rear elements actually protrude past the lens mount itself, meaning that the rear element actually sits inside your camera's body if you own a Leica. And the reason why I say that is because this lens is actually only available for Leica M mount. Though interestingly, Brightin Star have opted to do that intentionally and then just provide a choice of lens adapters so that it will fit on Sony E, Canon RF, Nikon Z, Fujifilm XF and GF X mounts. And I think that's kind of a smart move, because rather than making loads and loads of lenses in various different mounts, you just make one mount that's super versatile, like the Leica M mount, and then provide adapters so that it can be used on other cameras as well. Now, although it's fair to say that this lens will look great on just about any kind of camera, there's no denying that this level of retro aesthetic will really shine on something like a Leica or Fujifilm body. And seeing as I'm definitely not Oprah rich and I cannot afford a Leica, I'm going to have to settle for my secondhand Fujifilm X-Pro 2, which is fine by me. But as we've already discussed, in order to do that, I do need to attach it to an adapter first. And the only downside to doing this is that obviously it's going to add a little bit more depth to the lens and takes away some of the pancakiness of this pancake lens by about a centimeter in additional height. To me, that's not a deal breaker, but it's definitely something to consider. Though the good news for me is that by using this lens on a Fujifilm camera, it actually has a number of other advantages. The first being the focal length. Now, because my X-Pro uses an APS-C size sensor, once you've factored in the 1.5 times crop, this lens actually produces images that look closer to something like a 42mm lens on a full frame camera. And for street photography in particular, I really love this type of focal length because it captures super candid and natural looking images. And I actually think a lot of that is to do with the fact that this is a 42mm focal length specifically, because that's actually very close to the approximate focal length at which our eyes perceive the world. Now, the second advantage is that the crop means that the camera utilizes the center of the lens elements to capture an image. Now, this is relevant because broadly speaking, the center of any lens is typically the part that resolves the sharpest image, with the corners often providing a drop-off in sharpness and an increase in other optical issues. And unfortunately, this lens is no exception to that rule. Now, the reason why I know that is because I actually bought a Sony E-mount adapter so that I could use this lens on my Sony a7 Mark IV just to find out what the image quality was like when using a full frame sensor. And as you can see, the corners are super blurred. And that's because it turns out that this lens actually suffers from an issue called field curvature, which in very simple terms means that despite you getting the focus bang on at the center of the frame, the corners are actually focusing at a totally different distance, creating a rather unique blur effect. Now, although some people might like this effect because it definitely gives your photos a kind of retro or lomography kind of vibe, I am going to assume that most of you will want to avoid this issue entirely. So that's where shooting with something like a Fujifilm camera or any other crop sensor camera will certainly help to eliminate this kind of issue. Or alternatively, if you're shooting on a full frame Sony camera, you can just switch to APS-C crop mode and get the same results. But anyway, the bottom line is that once you have chopped off those corners, the center sharpness on this lens is actually very impressive, even while shooting wide open open at f2.8. And when shooting wide open, the benefit of having such a wide maximum aperture is that you're able to achieve quite a nice amount of subject separation, and the bokeh in general is actually quite pleasing to look at. One slight limitation of this lens though is that the minimum focusing distance is 70 centimeters or around 2.3 feet. So if capturing close-up detail shots is your thing, then this lens probably isn't the one for you. Though for street photography, where you're mainly shooting subjects at a distance, I really didn't find this to be a problem at all. Most of the time I would simply set the aperture to somewhere around f8 and then just use zone focusing to ensure that my subject was sharp. Now, speaking of aperture, to adjust the aperture on this lens, you actually have to rotate this absolutely microscopic ring in the middle, which, to be honest, can be a little bit fiddly and certainly isn't something that you can do very quickly, particularly if you're not looking at the lens itself. Also, a few of you mentioned in the comment section of the short video that I made about this lens a few months ago that you would totally be concerned about constantly smudging the front element every time you go to change the aperture. And whilst this is certainly possible, I also found that the best way to avoid this entirely is to simply attach this tiny little UV filter that you can buy as an optional extra when purchasing this lens. Plus, you can also use it to roleplay as an oil baron.
One day I'll sell enough oil to buy a Leica. Money, 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 money.
Once this is mounted to your lens, it actually sits slightly raised away from the lens body itself, making it not only much easier to locate the aperture ring because it sits right around the edge of it, but also it makes it much harder to smudge the front element because obviously your fingertips are not going to get anywhere near that front glass. Now, the only downside to this is that once it's attached, you can no longer screw on the screw-on lens cap. But minor gripes aside, this is probably one of the nicest lenses to focus with that I've ever found, because this tiny little lever at the bottom means that you can cradle the camera and then adjust the focus by rocking your index finger backwards and forwards. So at this point, you're probably wondering, how much does this lens cost? Well, currently on Brightin Star's website, it's 33% off, making it just under $360 plus shipping. But I actually found that if you go over to AliExpress, you can buy this exact lens directly from Brightin Star's official page on there for around $20 cheaper with free shipping. Nice. Plus, to add to that, I also found a bunch of discount codes floating around on there too, so potentially you could get it even cheaper than the listed price. As always, you can find all of the links you need in the description below. But the real question is it actually worth the asking price, particularly given the fact I've just listed off a bunch of gripes in this video, and I appreciate at this point you might even be wondering, do I even like this lens? Well, in my experience, few lenses are ever completely faultless, and there's always a compromise to be had, whether it's with the size, weight, build, or price. And I'd much rather be completely upfront and honest with you with the quirks of this lens so you can come to your own conclusions. But for me, what really matters, and this pretty much goes for anything that I buy these days, so long as the pros heavily outweigh the cons, then it's probably worth buying, and that's certainly how I feel about this lens. Sure, this is absolutely not the perfect lens, but its beautiful build quality, classic aesthetics, and small form factor drastically overshadow the small amount of handling and optical quirks, resulting in a lens that I'm just consistently excited to get out and shoot with.